I'm making an attempt here to trace the life of Jesus during the week he was crucified. I want to look at each day that led up to his death, burial, and resurrection on that Sunday. I want to look at all the gospel writers, and I want to make an attempt to harmonize what these writers are individually telling all of us about this week, commonly known as the Passion Week. It is appropriate here for me to begin with Saturday night, that is Saturday before what we call Palm Sunday. Our texts are John chapter 11 and 12, Matthew chapter 26, Mark chapter 12, and Luke chapter 19. Passover was drawing near, and many Jews were making their way to Jerusalem in order to take part in the Passover and the purification ceremony that was associated with the Passover. We read about that in John chapter 11 and verse 55. It is very interesting that Passover, in other words, the event Passover, is mentioned in the Gospel of John 3 times. First time we read about that in John chapter 3 and verse 24. This is the time period where Jesus started his earthly ministry already, and John the Baptist is still in the scene. So there is a bit of overlap is there between the ministry of Jesus and John the Baptist. Apparently, there were some dispute between the disciples of John and the Jews regarding the Passover. It doesn't tell us. It's probably right for us to conclude that Jesus did not take part in the Passover and all the ceremonies surrounding that. The second mention about Passover in the Gospel of John is in chapter 6 and verse 4. Jesus at this time is away from Jerusalem. He is in Galilee ministering, and there is a mention there in chapter 6 that Passover was nearing. Then again, there is no mention there whether Jesus took part in this event. Then the third mention is in the place where we have mentioned, that is in John chapter 11 and verse 55. This is Jesus' last Passover before his earthly ministry came to an end. So there are three different mentions of three different Passovers. So when we add all these three events, three separate Passovers together, definitely it is giving us more than 2 years, perhaps 2.5 years of time period is there. In John chapter 3 and also in John chapter 11, a purification ceremony is mentioned along with the Passover. This was a common practice of that time, and when we look at the Old Testament background of this purification ceremony or purification rites associated with the Passover, we come to Numbers chapter 9. For example, let's say there were people, for whatever reason, they had to handle a dead body. In those cases, before they can take part in the Passover celebration, Passover meal and all, they had to go through certain purification rituals. They had to be cleansed. This was commonly done a week prior to the Passover. This is why we see in John chapter 11 all these Jews coming to Jerusalem to purify themselves and to take part in the Passover. Apparently, it is interesting that Jesus did not take part in the Passover. We also learn in the passages that I have mentioned here, the Jewish leadership led by Caiaphas, the high priest, definitely wanted Jesus gone from the scene. In other words, they wanted him dead. We read about this in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 4. Perhaps this they wanted him gone because he was really popular among the people. Now, immediate connection. Why was he so popular at this time? I think we have to connect his popularity with the main event that happened very close to the Passover, maybe just a few days, maybe just a few months. That is the resurrection or raising of Lazarus from the dead. So in that text we read many Jews and others were present at that time. They witnessed Jesus raising this man from the dead. So he was really popular among the people. So because of that reason, they didn't want to take a step to kill him right away. Now, during this time of Passover, we see that Jesus came to Bethany, a small town called Bethany. Now, he was there before to raise Lazarus from his death, and Bethany is a small town about 3 kilometers away from Jerusalem. So, Saturday night, we find Jesus in the small town of Bethany, and apparently he was invited for a meal, a dinner. And we find him at the house of Simon the leper. Matthew chapter 26 and verse 6. Now, for obvious reasons, Lazarus was there along with two of his sisters. I mean, it was a small town. Jesus raised this man from the dead, and it's only natural that when Jesus is in that town, although he was dining in another man's home, Lazarus would come. Anyway, they were there. They ate together. In one of the texts we read that Jesus and Lazarus are sitting together, dining together. It is during this time, Mary, one of the sisters of Lazarus, anointed Jesus with costly, very expensive oil or perfume. In fact, the disciples were very much disturbed by this. They thought it was an absolute waste. Why waste all this money just anointing Jesus with this oil? Now, in John, we read that even though all of the disciples were disturbed, one decided to speak up, and that man was Judas Iscariot, who would betray Jesus in just a few days. And he specifically said he wanted this money to go towards feeding the poor. But it is very interesting to me that Jesus connected this anointing with oil by Mary. He connected that anointing with his death and burial once again, which will take place in a matter of just a few days, 6 days away, just a few hours we can say. Mark, perhaps the first gospel writer, he makes this very clear when he wrote Jesus' own words here. Let me read it for you. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Mark chapter 14 and verse 8. It is best for us to locate all this happening Saturday night, Saturday evening before the Palm Sunday. With these crucial events of incarnation in mind, see, this is why he came. This is why he incarnated. This is why he took on the form of a human. So I am sure if he said it outright that she was preparing my body for burial, that night, after all the crowd left, after everyone went to their own place, we don't know where he spent the night, but he must have gone to bed. He must have laid his head down for a night of sleep with all these events going through his mind. This is what took place on Saturday night.